James Harrison stood at the end of his driveway, hands on his hips, taking in a house he had built with his own two hands, or at least paid for with 2 decades of sweat and sacrifice. The soft hum of the imported Italian fountain filled the air, blending with the gentle rustling of the wind through the rose bushes his late wife had planted. The house was perfect. 3 stories of elegant stonework, arched windows, and a sprawling garden that had taken 5 years to perfect. He could almost hear Emily's voice in the back of his mind, teasing him about how much time he had spent obsessing over the placement of the roses. He smiled to himself, closing his eyes for a moment. Then, ding-dong. James sighed. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door, and there she was, Karen Thompson, standing with her arms crossed over a clipboard, her mouth stretched into a tight, practiced smile. The HOA polo shirt she wore was pressed so neatly it almost looked like armor. "Mr. Harrison," Karen said, holding out a pink slip of paper. James frowned as he took it. "What's this?" "A violation notice." Her tone was crisp and clinical. James's brow furrowed. "For what?" "Your rose bushes," Karen said, gesturing toward the front yard. "They're 2 inches over the height limit." James blinked. 2 inches? Are you serious? "Pinecrest Gardens is standards," Karen said, her smile tightening. "You have 48 hours to trim them, or face a $100 daily fine." James rubbed a hand down his face, glancing at the roses. They were flawless, lush, vibrant, and carefully trimmed. Emily had won award for them. He exhaled sharply, trying to keep his voice level. These roses were here when the house was built. They've been this height for years. Karen's eyes sharpened. "Exceptions lead to chaos, Mr. Harrison." He stared at her. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am." Her smile widened. "And I'm just getting started." James watched her turn and walk down the cobblestone driveway, stopping halfway to snap a picture of his mailbox. A chill crept up his spine. Something about the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence, the knowing smirk, made it clear this wasn't about the roses. The next morning, James opened his front door and found 5 more pink notices stuck to the glass. Unapproved water feature, non-conforming mailbox, excessive holiday decorations. James stared at them, mouth tightening into a hard line. It was February. The only decoration was a single heart-shaped wreath on the door, left over from Valentine's Day. Douglas Miller shuffled across the street, coffee mug in hand. He was a few years older than James, with a graying beard and the tired look of someone who'd lived in the neighborhood long enough to know better. Douglas shook his head. "She's not letting up, huh?" James held up the notices. "What's her problem?" Douglas sighed. "Karen's running for HOA president next month. Every election cycle, she picks a few homeowners to make an example of." James's jaw tightened. "And nobody fights back." Douglas gave him a sympathetic look. "It's easier to comply. The Johnsons tried to fight her last year. Their house sold under market value. Guess who bought it?" James's eyes narrowed. "Her brother?" Douglas nodded. "Careful, James. She's not just enforcing rules. She's playing chess." James tried calling the HOA management company. The woman on the other end sounded like she'd given this speech 100 times before. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison, but all violations are verified by our inspection team. You can appeal at next month's meeting. And in the meantime, the fines accumulate." James ran a hand through his hair. Unbelievable. His next stop was Karen's house. She answered the door with the same unreadable smile. "I'm just doing my job," she said when he confronted her. "My house is the most valuable one on the block," James said. Karen's eyes flashed. "Size isn't everything, Mr. Harrison. Conformity creates harmony." James took a step closer. "What's this really about?" Karen's smile faded for a split second. Then it snapped back into place. "Just follow the rules." She closed the door in his face. James stood there for a long moment, the cold air biting at his skin. His gut told him this was personal. But why? 2 weeks later, James sat at the back of the HOA meeting, arms crossed. He had paid over $1,400 in fines by then, more than enough to push a typical homeowner into financial strain. Karen sat at the front of the room, not yet president, but already controlling the conversation. Every time James tried to speak, the current president cut him off. "Compliance first, then appeals," the president said flatly. James's eyes flicked toward Karen's brother, sitting near the back. He was flipping through a folder of architectural plans. Later that night, James sat in front of the computer and pulled up property maps of Pinecrest Gardens. His lot was the largest in the neighborhood, positioned right at the entrance with the best view of the mountains. He started digging. Over the past 5 years, 7 other homeowners had been driven out after similar violation campaigns. All 7 properties were now owned by Thompson Development Group, Karen's brother's company. "That's the game," James whispered. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was orchestrating forced sales. She was creating opportunities for her brother's company to swoop in and buy low. James hired a private investigator the next morning. 2 days later, the investigator handed him a folder. "It's worse than you think," the investigator said. Inside were copies of emails, phone record, and financial statements showing direct ties between Karen and Thompson Development. Fines, for sales, and development contracts. It was all connected. James stared at the evidence, feeling heat rise up his spine. This wasn't just about money. This was calculated destruction. At 7 a.m., James woke to a loud knock on his door. 3 men in HOA polo shirts stood on his porch. Karen hovered behind them. "Mandatory safety inspection," the tallest man said, flashing a badge. James's eyes narrowed. "My lawyer advised no inspections without proper notice." Karen stepped forward. "Fire hazards require immediate attention." James's stomach turned. He allowed them inside, but followed closely, recording everything with his phone. The inspectors lingered by the electrical panel. James saw one of them slip something into his pocket. "What was that?" James asked. The inspector smiled. "Nothing." Karen's eyes glinted. James felt his pulse spike. That night, James woke to the smell of smoke. He ran upstairs to find flames crawling up the curtains in his office. He grabbed the fire extinguisher, but it barely made a dent. By the time the fire trucks arrived, his house was gone. Through the crowd, James spotted Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, watching. His eyes met hers. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. James's fist tightened. "You should have made sure I didn't survive," he whispered under his breath. Because now, he was coming for everything. James sat on the edge of the hotel bed, his elbows resting on his knees, head in his hands. The glow from the television flickered across his face, casting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The local news played muted footage of his house burning, the orange flames licking at the sky, swallowing 20 years of memories. His phone vibrated on the nightstand. He ignored it. Then it vibrated again. He sighed and picked it up. "Mr. Harrison?" a crisp female voice said. "Yes." James rubbed his eyes. "This is Lisa from Crestpoint Insurance. I'm calling about your claim." James sat up straighter. "Go ahead." "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison, but your policy does not cover fire damage." James's brows pulled together. "That's not right. My policies always covered fire damage." "Well, according to our records, you signed an amendment 3 weeks ago, excluding fire coverage." James's blood ran cold. "I didn't sign anything." There was a pause. "We have the signed document on file," Lisa said. "Send it to me." James's laptop was already open. An email arrived almost instantly. He opened the attachment and stared at the signature at the bottom. His name, his signature. But it wasn't his handwriting. "That's a forgery," James said, his voice sharp. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison," Lisa said with detached sympathy. "But without proof, we can't investigate further." James closed the laptop slowly, his jaw tightening. He had expected Karen to come after him, but this was calculated, ruthless. James stood and walked toward the window. Below, the city lights glowed faintly in the distance. He could feel the weight of the loss pressing against his chest. But beneath that weight, something else was forming. Resolve. Karen had burned down his house. Now she was trying to leave him with nothing. Big mistake. James sat at the small round table in the corner of his hotel room, his phone pressed to his ear. His knuckles were white from gripping the phone so tightly. "James." Douglas's tired voice answered on the other end. "I need a favor," James said. Douglas hesitated. "What kind of favor?" James took a steadying breath. "I need you to talk to the neighbors. Ask if anyone's had trouble with their insurance or been pressured to sell after getting hit with violations." "James, I'm not letting this slide." His voice was sharper than he intended. He took a breath. "Please, Douglas." Douglas sighed. "All right, I'll see what I can find out." James hung up and called his lawyer next. "It's a forgery," James said. "Figure out who authorized the policy change." "I'll dig into it," the lawyer replied. James's last call was to his private investigator. "I need everything you can find on Karen and her brother," James said. "Business deals, property records, anything shady." "You're serious about this," the investigator said. James's mouth set into a hard line. "She took everything from me. I'm not letting her get away with it." James leaned back in the chair, his heart pounding. He didn't have much left, but he still had a brain. And money. Karen thought he was finished. She had no idea what was coming. 3 days later, James sat in the sleek glass office of his banker. His suit was pressed, his tie straight, but his eyes were sharp and cold. The banker, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, leaned forward nervously. $6 million. "Yes," James said without hesitation. The banker cleared his throat. "That's a lot of liquidity to move at once. Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure." James's voice was steady. "And you intend to invest it into Evergreen Community Management?" "Yes." The banker hesitated. "It's not a controlling stake, Mr. Harrison. You'll own 30%, but that's enough." James's private investigator had given him everything he needed. Evergreen managed dozens of HOA communities, including Pine Crest Gardens. Karen wasn't working alone. She was part of a network of corrupt business deals, shady land grabs, and illegal fines. One of Evergreen's major shareholders was looking to sell. $6 million was exactly the right price. By the time James left the bank that afternoon, the deal was done. No one knew James was the buyer. Not yet. That evening, a certified letter arrived at his hotel. He already knew what it was before he opened it. A violation notice, signed by Karen. Subject: property violation. You are required to clear the debris from your burned property within 10 days or face a $500 daily fine. James smiled. "Oh, Karen," he murmured. "You have no idea what's coming." Pine Crest Gardens Community Center was packed. Folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Karen stood at the front of the room, wearing her signature pearls and a practiced smile. "As you all know," Karen said, her voice polished and smooth, "the Harrison property has become an eyesore." James stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching. "The insurance company is dragging their feet," Karen continued, "but we can't allow this blight to bring down our property values." James's eyes darkened. "I propose we use a community reserve fund to purchase the lot," Karen said, "and convert into a neighborhood park." Douglas stood up. "Shouldn't we give James a chance to rebuild?" Karen's smile sharpened. "Unfortunately, Mr. Harrison failed to maintain proper insurance coverage. This gives us an opportunity to improve the community." James pushed away from the wall. "I have a question." Karen's smile vanished. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her tone clipped, "this isn't the time." James stepped toward the front of the room. He pulled a stack of papers from his leather folder. 3 days ago, James said, his voice calm, "I purchased a 30% stake in Evergreen Community Management." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face went pale. "You what?" "As the largest shareholder," James said, "I'm calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning." Karen's hand trembled as she took the papers from him. This can't be real." "Oh, it's very real." James stepped closer. His voice dropped low enough that only Karen could hear. "And my first order of business?" James's eyes narrowed. "A complete audit of all HOA financial activity for the past 5 years." Karen's breath hitched. "You can't do that," she whispered. James smiled faintly. "Actually, I can." The next morning, James sat at the head of the long conference table in Evergreen's glass-wall boardroom. His lawyer sat to his left, a forensic accountant to his right. Karen sat at the opposite end, her hands twisted together. Her brother sat beside her, pale and sweating. James slid a folder across the table. These are financial records showing illegal fines and selective enforcement. He slid another folder toward Karen. This one shows how Thompson Development acquired properties below market value after targeted HOA campaigns. Karen's hands shook. And this, James said, placing the last folder in front of her, is security footage showing your brother on my property the night of the fire. Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The boardroom door opened. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. "Mrs. Thompson," one officer said, "we need you to come with us." Karen's chair scraped loudly as she stood. You can't do this." James's gaze was cold and steady. "You took everything from me," he said quietly. "Now, I'm taking everything from you." Karen's face crumbled as the officers led her away. Everything. Big mistake. Karen had burned down his house. Now she was trying to leave him with nothing. James sat at Douglas's dining table, feeling the weight of a dozen anxious eyes on him. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan overhead. An elderly woman with silver curls sat closest to him, twisting her hands together in her lap. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "My husband and I moved here 30 years ago," she said quietly. "After he passed, the fines started coming. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but they just kept piling up." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What kind of fines?" "Grass height," she said, her voice shaking. "Then mailbox placement. Then they said my fence was the wrong color, even though it was the same color when we moved in." A younger man across the table, probably in his early 30s, spoke next. His jaw was tight. "They threatened to put a lien on my house," he said. "Told me I could avoid it if I paid for a consultation with Karen." James's stomach twisted. He could feel his anger simmering beneath his calm expression. Douglas sat next to him, arms crossed. "James," he said, his voice low, "it's not just them." James's eyes sharpened. "How many?" "At least 10 families," Douglas said. Karen targeted people she thought were vulnerable. New homeowners, elderly couples, people who couldn't afford a legal fight. James closed his eyes for a brief moment, his fists curling beneath the table. He inhaled slowly through his nose and opened his eyes. "We're not going to let this slide," James said. An older man at the end of the table frowned. "How?" "She's gone, but the fines and liens are still on record." James's jaw tightened. "I own the management company now." The table went still. "What does that mean?" the younger man asked. "It means," James said, his voice calm but sharp, "we're going to wipe every single one of those fines off the books." The elderly woman's eyes widened. "You can't just erase them?" "Yes," James said. "I can." James stood in front of a packed room at the Pine Crest Gardens Community Center. Folding chairs lined the walls, and there wasn't an empty seat in sight. Sophia Rodriguez, the new interim president, stood beside him with a clipboard pressed to her chest. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, but James could see the tension in her shoulders. James took a steady breath and faced the room. "I know the last few months have been difficult," James said. His voice carried through the room, low and steady. "Many of you have faced unfair fines, pressure to sell your homes, and threats of legal action." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People nodded. James continued. "After a full investigation, we've determined that most of those violations were selectively enforced. Effective immediately, all pending fines issued under Karen Thompson's leadership will be voided." Gasps filled the room. Someone in the back clapped. James held up a file. "If you lost your home because of Karen's targeted harassment or illegal fines, we're going to make it right. You'll have the chance to reclaim your property at no cost." An elderly man in the second row wiped his eyes with his sleeve. A woman in the back stood. "How can we trust this isn't just another empty promise?" James's gaze softened. "Because I'm not Karen," he said simply. Douglas stood up. "I've known James for over 10 years. He's not doing this for power. He's doing it because it's the right thing to do. James's throat tightened. A young mother stood up, her toddler balanced on her hip. So, no more fines for things like mailbox height or Christmas lights? James smiled faintly. Not unless your mailbox is neon green. Laughter spread through the room. James's gaze swept across the crowd. For the first time in months, people were looking at him not with suspicion, but with hope. He could work with that. 3 months later, James stood on the edge of his lot, hands resting on his hips. The sun was setting, casting warm gold light across the half-built frame of his new house. Douglas walked up beside him, holding 2 beers. He handed one to James. "Looks good," Douglas said, tipping his chin toward the construction site. James took a sip from the bottle. "Getting there. You sure about adding a community wing?" Douglas asked. James nodded. "This isn't just going to be a house. It's going to be a place where people can come together. The new house would have a hall large enough to hold neighborhood meetings, a library, a kitchen for potlucks and cooking classes, and the garden, Emily's Roses, would be open for everyone. You don't owe this community anything," Douglas said. James smiled faintly. "I know. So, why are you doing it?" James's eyes darkened. "Because someone has to show them what leadership is supposed to look like." Sophia approached, holding a clipboard. Permits came through. "Already?" James said. Sophia smiled. "Turns out, when you don't have a corrupt board dragging your feet, things move faster." James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from the builder. Roof installation complete. On schedule for final inspection next month. James smiled to himself. Karen had burned his house to the ground. Now he was building something even stronger. The housewarming party was bigger than James expected. The new hall was packed with neighbors. Douglas manned the grill outside, and Stephanie was setting up dessert trays in the kitchen. James stood in the corner of the hall, watching as kids ran through the open doors into the garden. The roses were in bloom, a bright burst of red against the deep green. Mrs. Kaplan, the elderly woman from Douglas's house, approached him with a glass of lemonade. "I never thought I'd see this place like this," she said. James smiled. "Me neither." "You didn't have to do all this," she said. James shook his head. "Yeah, I did." Douglas walked up, clapping James on the shoulder. "Neighborhood feels different, doesn't it?" James nodded. "Because it is." A young couple approached. "James," the man said, "we're new here. Just want to say thank you for, well, everything." James's chest tightened. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, shaking the man's hand. James watched as people laughed and talked. For the first time in years, Pinecrest Gardens didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a home. 2 weeks later, James was sitting in his study when his phone buzzed. Sophia's name lit up the screen. "James," she said, "turn on the news." James grabbed the remote and flipped on the television. A reporter stood in front of a suburban development. "Following the HOA scandal at Pinecrest Gardens," the reporter said, "new investigations have opened into HOA corruption across the state. Several former HOA leaders are facing charges for fraud and abuse of power." James's eyes sharpened. "That's not all," Sophia said. "A lawyer from California called me. They want to know if you'd be willing to advise other neighborhoods facing similar problems." James leaned back in his chair. "Maybe." Sophia laughed. "You're not finished yet?" James's smile was quiet. "Not even close." "Oh," Sophia added, "one more thing. Karen's trial date is set." James's eyes darkened. "Good." James stood and walked toward the window. The roses swayed gently in the breeze. Karen had tried to burn him to the ground. Instead, she had given him the reason to rebuild something stronger. James smiled to himself. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about building something better.